Conquer the Noise is a podcast produced by Unconquered, an independent agency challenging brand perspective to redefine content. This podcast is dedicated to telling stories of outstanding ideas and people who have found their way amongst the chatter. Hi, everyone. This is your host of Conquer the Noise, Jonathan Hansen. Thank you for joining us today. We have Nick Reinke from Truterra. Now, if you haven't heard of Truterra, I'm not totally surprised. It's not a consumer-facing brand, but interestingly enough, it greatly affects consumers. They're one of those companies that sits in the shadows of our food system and work closely with farmers. It's owned by Land O'Lakes, so not totally surprised that it's working directly with farmers. But what they do is they work on conservation solutions for long-term sustainability within the food system. They provide customized efficiency tools to improve yield and reduce nutrient loss while protecting natural resources. Nick, thank you so much for joining the show today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
So Nick, you're the Senior Manager, Strategy and Market Development at Truterra. That's a very long title, which is a subsidiary of Land O'Lakes. So Nick, I would love to have you tell us a little bit about Truterra, what it is, what it's about, because it's relatively new. It's a new part of Land O'Lakes business, and I think it's something that's super interesting, and the public needs to learn more about it.
Yeah, definitely. So Truterra, pretty unique organization as part of a larger unique organization at Land O'Lakes. Truterra is the sustainability business at Land O'Lakes. Land O'Lakes being a 100-year-old farmer-owned cooperative, actually turning 100 this year. Pretty exciting for us.
Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah. It's an old bunch, but we play young. So anyway, Land O'Lakes is just an incredible org. So when we say a farmer-owned cooperative system at Land O'Lakes, we are actually owned by a broader system of agricultural cooperatives throughout the United States. So these cooperatives are owned by the farmers that they serve. They provide them with access to the grain marketplace, but also with agricultural inputs like seed and fertilizer and their necessary herbicides and things like that. So we support that network that is in turn our member owners. So this federation of cooperatives owns Land O'Lakes Enterprise. Mm-hmm. So at Land O'Lakes, everybody's familiar with the dairy side of things. We've got Land O'Lakes butter that everybody knows very well. Great part of our organization. But then we also have Winfield United, which is a ag inputs distribution business that delivers those seeds and fertilizer products to our agricultural cooperatives and in turn to the farmers that we serve, reaching approximately 50% of the harvested acres in the United States. So pretty significant footprint there. And then we've got Purina animal feed. So a lot of people are familiar with Purina on the pet feed. That's actually Nestle Purina. So if it barks or meows, that's Nestle. But if it moos, clucks, or neighs, that's Purina with us. And then finally, Truterra at Land O'Lakes. So we were launched about 5 years ago with this recognition that we really needed to help our farmers understand the role that they play in the sustainability space, the opportunity that they have to improve stewardship on their farm, but also just to understand, what is agriculture's role in land stewardship, greenhouse gas emissions, watershed stewardship, those kinds of things. So with that, Land O'Lakes launched Truterra. Originally, Land O'Lakes Sustain about 5 years ago. We're known as Truterra today.
So I'm just going to repeat something back to you to see if I totally understand and follow. So Truterra is made up of a series of co-ops, and these co-ops are made up of farmers. And I'm curious, is that correct? Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
And I'm curious. So are these co-ops made of just one type of farmer? Is there going to be dairy? Is it going to be more like agricultural crops? Are they sort of a cluster or a variety of different types of farmers within that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Land O'Lakes as an enterprise is interesting because there are dairy member owners as part of the cooperative system. But then we have also the agricultural cooperative member owners, which are these farm service businesses that I was referring to that get farmers the ag inputs and grain marketing access. So it's a little bit of both, where it is row crop agriculture, dairy farms, really across the board, livestock producers and row crop.
Interesting. Okay. So, I'm from the Midwest. I know you're calling from the Midwest as well, in Minneapolis. It's not just all farm country. It's not just all crops, but there's a lot there. And it's definitely part of my childhood, seeing and being around it. I'm curious, your journey didn't start at Truterra. You started way before that, and you are in fact a farmer yourself. Do you have a family farm in Minnesota?
Yeah, family farm is actually in North Dakota. So
North Dakota.
come
Okay.
from, yeah, so we are, what would I be? I think fourth or fifth generation on the family farm back there. All the cousins, all the aunts and uncles, everybody on both sides of the family farms back there. So still involved in the family farm. Right now it's dad and brother primarily running it, and they let me drive stuff once in a while. And then, yeah, from there for the last 10 years, I continued to work on the farm as well as working in ag banking and crop insurance before joining the Truterra team. So that was kind of the arc there. It's always been close to farmers, supporting farmers, but then looking at, how can I support farmers' engagement in this space and, in the fight against climate change, but also in sustainability more broadly. And how can I do that at a kind of a more system scale as opposed to an individual farmer to farmer scale?
Yeah, so it sounds like you really are taking your experience and using it as inspiration to help, I think, further and push the standards and profit making and protection of farmers. Is there anything, like, I'm curious if there was a specific story or experience from your earlier days when you were working more full time on the farm? I know it sounds like you still go back and still work, but is there just that moment that you saw something happened that started this sort of new found focus or passion? I know, I think that's one of the most interesting stories of founders and business people, I think, are their origin stories a lot of times. Not that you have to have one to validate yourself, but I'm just curious if there's anything there that helped sort of push you along.
Yeah, there is a little bit of that. So it was partially understanding from my own personal career journey, thinking about what the impact of my career was going to be, and recognizing, a few times in human history has there been the kind of impact and desperate need that we have that can translate into a single lifetime, as we do with climate change, right? There's a lot to be done. And then I started seeing more and more in agriculture related to that. And then I looked at our family farm and some neighboring farms, and there was always this kind of, what the heck is that neighbor doing planting these cover crops? We're farming corn and he's raising radishes and not even harvesting them, kind of thing. So it was, what's that goofy guy doing over there, and what's the thought process? So then just digging into that and recognizing every single farmer is a great steward of their land, and they really care about taking care of that land for multiple generations. My family farm's no exception. But getting into some of these more advanced conservation practices, they seem crazy in the context of modern farming, but they're not crazy at all in the context of sustainable farming, improving soil health, and sequestering carbon. So it was having to reconcile that idea of good farm stewardship versus some of these practices that were, even more advanced and almost hard to understand from the classical farming perception. So that really just caused me to dig in, start kind of informally interviewing those neighbors that were doing those more advanced practices. And then that spiraled into this idea that, okay, I want to do something about this, but at a larger scale that actually represents the on-farm realities, because these practice change transitions they're hard, they're complicated, and they're not well understood today.
Well, they are complicated. And just reading through, I spent a fair amount of time, as I mentioned earlier, just reading through, educating myself on Truterra and the work you're all are doing and the goals and mission of it. And it's definitely a complicated process when you think, you think farming straightforward. It should be, you grow things, you get it to people and it's done. But this is obviously a lot more complicated than that, especially when you start working in food cycles, weather, and then cover crops, as we were talking about earlier. And so there's really sort of three stages that Truterra is working within, from what I understand. And you can please tell me if I'm totally wrong. But, it's working on the early stage of the farmer. And then you sort of have the middle stage, the grain operators, or the people, I guess, that you then get the product or the produce or the grains from the farmer. And then those go then to the corporations, the CPG companies that then make it into something. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's accurate. It's working with these different entities that are all connected across the supply chain, and they all have different needs and issues to work through when it comes to advancing sustainability. But yeah, you're right on. It takes working with all of those entities to support it.
And so then Truterra then created, I want to say, a software program, a data-driven approach to building in more sustainable practices across this. So I would love to hear how, like, what this makes this data and this software so unique, and then how it's being now translated, I guess, into action.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, the ag tech space in general, there's a lot of brilliant people putting a lot of resources into ag tech. So you can only do so much with the tech. It's really how you use it, but it's also understanding the user base. So for Truterra, what I think is really cool about this platform, in agriculture, a lot of times the data is kind of a one-way flow, some extractive really, right? So the farmer provides the data, downstream companies are looking to get that data, but what's the value back to the farmer for sharing that data? Ultimately, it's been pretty limited. And that's a really cool thing about the way that the designers of Truterra put this together, is it's meant to, in turn, for the data, give insights back to the farmer that are relevant and actionable to the farmer, right? So you reported data to the Truterra Insights engine, and we can aggregate and report on that data and, model out greenhouse gas implications. But guys like my dad, he doesn't care what his greenhouse gases are. He cares what his productivity and his return on investment is, right? Like, what does this mean for my production system? So within Truterra, you can look at things like soil erosion and nutrient use efficiency. How much of my fertilizer is actually making it into the production versus washing away down the waterway, or not making it into the plant, essentially. So where am I wasting money on the farm? And then within that, it's a live decision sandbox where I can say, well, I've been told I should consider reducing tillage. What would that mean for me in terms of profitability, in terms of nutrient management, soil loss, soil health, soil organic matter? Where am I gaining organic matter? Because farmers know that that's a good thing, which is also gaining carbon, right? So it's kind of tying those insights to the things that matter to the farmer, rather than things that maybe are less relevant as a decision tool of the farmer, but still things that a CPG company wants to understand about their supply shed.
So, I mean, you mentioned no-till. So I think there are things that it sounds like Truterra is recommending farmers do, or are part of the process, and no-till is one of them. I didn't realize this, but I didn't realize, tilling, dredging up the ground basically releases carbon because that's where it's stored. What other things are you guys doing to help sort of mitigate the release of carbon, or in turn improve the soil health?
Yeah, that's, no-till is a big lever to pull here, but there are a number of other ones. And to be really clear, we don't particularly recommend any practices. The thing that we are able to do is basically the exciting part of, things like carbon markets and things like that, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is being able to tie financial mechanisms to externalities like greenhouse gas emissions. So for us, it's mostly just putting the opportunity in front of the farmer and helping them understand how best to make an impact. But with that, reduced tillage is a really key one. Things like adding cover crops. So it's keeping living roots in the ground. It's protecting the soil. And this has all kinds of different benefits between, it goes from carbon benefits to water loss mitigation benefits and water management benefits. So the more that you keep up that soil structure and don't break it down through tillage, the better that ground manages moisture as well. So we're seeing more and more extreme rainfall events, for instance, where we're getting kind of the same amount of rain across the Midwest, but it's coming in shorter and more intense events. And if you have a better soil structure, you capture and retain more of that moisture rather than having that run off along with some of your topsoil. Right. And the same goes for drought management. You manage soil temperature by doing that. So again, it's reducing tillage, not necessarily always no-till, but at the very least, reducing tillage to keep up that soil structure, but also just adding crop mass, whether that is, again, through things like cover crops, or there's some pretty incredible things that happen with the microbiome as well when you get your nutrient management right. That if the nutrient balance is out of whack, then you see your soil microbes behave differently than when the nutrient balance is sort of aligned with a more natural ecosystem. And that's a whole different topic that we could go off into the weeds on, but probably outside the scope here.
Well, speaking of weeds, I know the radishes aren't weeds, but you brought them up earlier as far as seeing your neighbors use radishes. And I've read in other literature that radishes are a good cover crop. Is that because of just what you just spoke about, the microbiome and helping those particular plants bring a certain aspect to that, or a nutrient profile? Or why radishes?
Yeah, I say radishes a little bit as a tongue-in-cheek joke, just because that was kind of the coffee shop conversation back then. I'd say things like cereal rye and other crops like that are probably much more common as a cover crop. But you see a lot of advanced cover crop cocktails that come out as well, where radishes might be one of the crops that's included in that cocktail. And there's a whole variety of different reasons to use these different crop types. Some it's about, adding a larger amount of biomass, right? So different ones like radish obviously are adding some below ground biomass. Other ones are better nitrogen scavengers. So what happens when we talk about nutrient management and nitrate runoff and issues in watersheds and like the hypoxic zone of the Gulf of Mexico and stuff like that, where that's coming from is that nitrogen wasn't optimally used by the crop in the field. So when there's residual nitrogen left over, what happens with it? Well, it'll be released in the form of nitrous oxide. It'll run off into local watersheds. But if you use a good nitrogen scavenging cover crop, now you've locked that nitrogen into a bioavailable form that will stay in the field and be able to be used by plants in the coming year. So that's one good reason to look at different mixes of cover crops, is to capture your nutrients that are left over in the soil after your crop year.
No, you also talked about basically how do you get people to care? You broke it down in some ways, at least when you're speaking to the farmer, as far as what helps bottom line, helps efficiency. But again, like I'm sure there's a little bit of distrust, or there's going to be a little bit of, I don't know, maybe not fully on board with someone that they've never met coming to their farm and telling them how to farm. How do you overcome that? That sounds like a big challenge.
Yeah, that is a great point. And that's really a key way that Truterra operates. So like we mentioned with the farmer-owned cooperative system, right? So we've got this network of cooperatives that's been around for decades, or even, better part of 100 years, like I said. And these are the groups that the message is delivered through. So it's the same folks that are talking to farmers every year, every day about what's happening on their farm, giving them advice around seed choices and the variable rate fertilization and how they manage fertilizer on their farm and doing the soil test. So it's about going through that trusted network to the farmer. So it's not, not me jumping in the car and driving around the country telling guys how to farm carbon, right? Coming out of the blue. And that's a challenge here, right? Is that there are a lot of tech plays in this space that have really incredible tech, but at the end of the day, if you don't have that trusted position with the farmer, like you say, that message just kind of falls on deaf ears, because trust is a really, really key component of, who are my advisors in the farm? Who am I listening to? Who's been around and who is more to me than just a little carbon offtake or something like that. So that ag cooperative network is a really, really key part of the way that we operate, and we will continue to work through that network of cooperatives and ag retailers.
Yeah, and this is a little bit off topic in some ways, but I'm just really curious, because I think that's a really interesting challenge that you're sort of faced with, as far as educating and getting the message out about a complicated product in service. And when you're speaking to the larger co-ops, how are you educating them? How are you teaching them? Is there a strong role in content as far as video or collateral and brochures? Is it, are you on planes a lot, flying and speaking to people? I'm really curious what that's like.
Yeah. I mean, it's a challenge. It's very much an in-person relationship still in the rural agriculture world. So we do have a whole field team that their role isn't to go out and talk to farmers. It's actually go out and talk to the cooperatives.
Yeah.
So exactly to your point, we have a whole team that's going out and meeting with the cooperatives, helping them understand what the opportunity is for their farmers, but also helping them understand what the value is of on-farm data and just understanding some of these next level concepts. And, it's a challenge until you actually use it for a little bit, but you start to see farmers know where the problem areas are in their fields, right? Just inherently, you know where the bad soil is, you know where the water issues are. But to be able to put that into a piece of technology that can then visualize it and monetize it and say, this is exactly where you're losing, and this is your profitability by section of the field. So now you can say, oh boy, I didn't realize I was actually, I've been losing money for the last 10 years on that 10 acres. Why am I even bothering? Or at least I got to look at it differently. So you just have to kind of make it visceral and real. And it's a lot easier to do that when you're sitting there at the table with with a cooperative member who can then put an example farm in there and say, oh man, yeah, I want to go out and talk to my farmer about this opportunity for them, rather than having this kind of hand wavy conversation around ag sustainability that doesn't get anybody jumping out of bed in the morning. Well, it gets me jumping out of bed in the morning, but I'm an anomaly in that space probably.
You touched on it a little bit, because my next question was opportunity. What is the opportunity for farmers? And you talked a little bit about it just now, as far as talking about, potential areas to improve and talking through, where they can see deficiencies in soil and so forth. But what are some of these other opportunities that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, there's getting to be a lot of them. I mean, there's a ton of news in this space around the carbon marketplace. And that's something we can dig into a little bit, because it's really interesting in agriculture right now, but even more broadly globally.
I would love to.
So the carbon market. So the carbon marketplace is probably a good place to start. But to be clear, I mean, there are opportunities for farmers to monetize many different things, like watershed sustainability. There's watershed impacts that we should definitely talk about as well. But first, with the carbon market, kind of high level. I don't know how high you want me to go with the carbon market.
I think we should
really broad.
We'll start with. I'm a dummy. I'm your student today, so I would love it to hear, what is a carbon credit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a carbon credit, in simplest terms, is 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, equivalent meaning a ton of carbon dioxide, or a certain equivalent volume of methane emissions or nitrous oxide emissions or whatever, but equated to 1 ton of carbon dioxide. And that is a transactable credit for a company to be able to justifiably purchase that credit and leverage that credit against their own footprint. So if companies are looking to be more sustainable or reduce their carbon footprint, they can buy offsets. Now, there are a lot of challenges in the marketplace. Obviously, one being, does that just mean that a company can emit as many emissions as they want? They can pollute as much as they want and just offload it somewhere else, right? The thing that we can say confidently there is, it's incredible how complex the accounting mechanisms are to deal with exactly that issue, to ensure that there's this concept of additionality, that because this carbon credit was purchased, there's actually a net reduction in carbon emissions, or there is carbon that has been sequestered that wouldn't have been if not for the carbon credit transaction. So it's not just sort of a zero-sum game here. There's actually beneficial investment driven. So with that, as it relates to agriculture specifically, this is an opportunity for a farmer to say, maybe it's not entirely clear why I would look to add more organic matter to my soil, or the financial picture doesn't quite pencil out for me to change practices, because there's some very real challenges, as I mentioned, with adding cover crops or reducing tillage. It introduces some risk and some cost to the farm. And that's where there's this opportunity for them to basically monetize the externality of that component of the farm. So if that externality is sequestering carbon or reducing related emissions, and there's now a financial mechanism available to incentivize a farmer to do that, now we can get farmers, emitting less or adding more carbon to their soil, which is beneficial to them on farm, but also not necessarily something that would have happened if not for the additional incentive of a carbon marketplace and that ability to leverage financing from outside the agricultural sector, right? That's kind of an interesting outcome of this, is you have, companies that wouldn't otherwise have a reason to invest in soil health on farm, other than the fact that they have a very real need in carbon emissions. And this is one great way for them to make an impact on that.
So it's kind of like paying it forward in a weird way, or saying like, hey, if you do this and you improve this much, I'm going to reward you by buying your carbon credit. Basically, am I getting that? Okay, so
yeah, that's absolutely it. Yep.
It's really interesting concept. And so in the end, these carbon credits have values, right? So I've seen these values range anywhere from like $10 to $40 per credit, or per metric ton. How are those values? And maybe this might be getting too deep into it, but I'm curious how those values are assessed. And then, like, what does that actually mean for a farmer? So are they offsetting enough carbon to where like a $40 credit is going to be worthwhile for them in the long run?
And yeah, that's a great question and a really challenging one. So we'll take market price first. And this is where the carbon credit marketplace gets really messy really quickly, is because there are a lot of different ways to effectively generate a carbon credit. So carbon credits can be something as simple as an avoided emission, a scrubber on a smokestack, if you will, right? When that smokestack doesn't have the scrubber on it, it's emitting a certain amount. You add the scrubber, and now you've reduced the emissions come out of that. But then you have alternatives like soil carbon sequestration, where we're actually removing legacy load carbon from the atmosphere, right? So it's actually pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it in the soil, and that's a carbon sink. And depending on the marketplace and the market mechanism, those two things could be viewed as relatively equivalent, because a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon in a voluntary marketplace. But just based on a very basic description, you can see how 1 ton of carbon is, okay, great, it's less emissions, right? But the other ton of carbon is adding organic matter to the soil, adding to on-farm resilience, and it's actually pulling down carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it somewhere. So they're very different activities, resulting in something that could potentially be viewed by the marketplace as one and the same. So that's where we see all that price variability in the market right now, is sort of this lack of clarity, but evolving clarity in terms of the relative value of one carbon abatement or carbon removal effort or technology versus another. And I think there's a ton of market discovery yet to be done there. But exactly to that point, getting to the second part of your question, is even $40 a ton enough to make it worth it for a farmer? And to put that into a really simple example, when it comes to soil carbon sequestration, you can sequester, maybe half a ton per acre per year. Varies greatly by region and soil type and crop rotation, but we'll just use that as an easy example. So half a ton per acre per year equates to, assuming zero cost to the transaction, which we all know is not real, but let's say it doesn't cost anything to make the transaction, $40 a ton, $20 an acre. Okay. Well, if I wanted to add cover crops as part of that carbon sequestration practice, cover crop is going to cost me anywhere between $20 and $40 an acre just to add the cover crop and go through the process of planting it, terminating it. And that's not even to note the fact that this represents a change for me on farm. This is a different way of farming. So I'm introducing another layer of complexity and risk to my farm without, a clear known payoff, and not even offsetting the cost completely with the carbon credit, right? So that's where for us, it really needs to be that broader conversation around stewardship and the benefits of stewardship, the ways that it reduces risk on the farm, the ways that it adds other values above and beyond the carbon credit marketplace. So it needs to not just be about carbon, because even at the, assuming that prices in the carbon marketplace go up, which there are a lot of fundamentals indicating that there's a good chance that they will in the years to come. Even at $100 a ton, there are a lot of farmers that I know that probably wouldn't make significant change to their farming practices, even for $40 or $50 an acre, because when you look at row crop agriculture in the Midwest, they might be grossing over $1,000 an acre. So $40 or $50 an acre to fundamentally change the way that they farm, that's a pretty tough conversation to deliver. So it needs to be integrated, and it needs to make sense in more ways than just sequestering carbon. But it's a great spark to have this conversation more deeply with farmers. And that, I think, is one of the most interesting pieces happening right now, is the fact that this conversation is being sparked in a way that, it maybe never has really around soil health. I mean, this has made its way into every coffee shop around the Midwest. They're talking about carbon credits, whether or not they're doing anything about them yet. It's definitely it's a hot topic.
And I think it is really interesting, especially when you get into this idea of a marketplace, and it kind of opens up, I think, all the finance nerds' ears pick up a little bit, just because it gets super interesting on the idea of buying and selling carbon credits. And I'm curious, if you look into your crystal ball, I mean, obviously we can't all predict the future, but do you see or envision or think it would be beneficial to sort of partial out like classes of carbon credits? You kind of hinted at it a little bit, as far as, ones that sort of are retained within the soil and are actually producing more environmental good in many ways, versus those that are just sort of offsetting the creation of carbon in whatever form it was done. So immediately when I thought of that, I thought of asset classes or classes of value between those two. And I'm curious if you think things will evolve that way, or would I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that is a really insightful question, because we actually have had exactly those conversations with a few folks in the terms of asset classes. I think what that gets immediately challenging is when you start to talk about relative values of assets, right? So if we were to turn this into an asset class, it kind of depends on what component of the asset you value most, right? So do you most value the impact to rural community vitality and on-farm resilience and other watershed impacts? Or do you most value the fact that you can be absolutely certain that that ton of carbon has been stored somewhere that it'll never be released from, right? Because that's another challenge in agriculture is, if we store carbon in the soil and then turn back into an intensive tillage practice 5 or 10 years down the road, now ultimately that carbon's only been stored for about 5 or 10 years, right? So that's where you really have this trade-off, where there are a lot of ways that I can argue for agricultural soil carbon to be one of the most valuable forms of carbon sequestration. But there are certain other components that definitely, present challenges. So I think that's a place where asset classes become pretty difficult pretty quickly. So today in the marketplace, it seems to be a lot more sort of bespoke relationships and transactions and B2B type things, where companies have a certain set of goals and parameters around quality that they care about. But I think, to your point, I think that will necessarily evolve into some form of an asset class. But it'd be interesting to see how that shakes out, right? Because
it's super interesting.
Pretty new. Yeah.
It's very new. It's very interesting. And I know they're not related by any means, but just in some ways, like this, it kind of reminds me of crypto and the new exploratory market going into crypto and all the different currencies that are emerging, and the NFTs and all these new ideas and ways of thinking about currency and credit. And I think it's super fascinating. And I can just totally see this playing into it, especially as we get even more and more focus on environmental sustainability. And I think it's really interesting. I also read recently that, the current Biden administration has proposed creating like a carbon bank effectively, and to help sort of, guarantee a buyer of agricultural credits or carbon credits. And it was moved through the Senate over the last couple of weeks. And I'm really curious to how that's going to evolve and start shaping larger reform, because I think in the end, like, consumers can always vote with their dollar. But when it comes to like huge systematic change, and we're talking farming, where thousands and millions of acres in the United States, I think it's going to take some governmental action and support, and help establishing that work to make it more incentivized for farmers. They've incentivized farming through subsidies in other areas, and I'm really curious to how this is going to help continue to play out as we build more focus around carbon and climate change. That's a very long.
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, there definitely has to be a public component to this, private, all of it. It's going to take all of it, because, like you say, this is massive systems change that we're talking about, and there are a lot of structures already in place at the USDA and at the federal government level that are pretty well designed to actually tackle some of this stuff. I think one of the biggest challenges in this space is recognizing where it can be additive versus mutually exclusive. So that's a real challenge in carbon markets and carbon accounting is, for these accounting mechanisms to work, it needs to be abundantly clear that, if there was an investment in this carbon credit, there aren't multiple people claiming the same impact, right? Because if you have multiple people claiming the same impact, now you've maybe reduced the overall level of impact that's being had on a systems or a global scale. So the accounting mechanisms are really careful to prevent sort of that double counting. So to the example of like a federal carbon bank, say the United States decides to invest in this space and really goes big on carbon, there are ways in which they could structure that such that they don't compete with the private market. So they could structure incentives around climate smart agriculture and sustainable agriculture that are additive but not competitive with the private marketplace, thereby multiplying the dollars that can make it to the acre to drive this impact and drive adoption. As we talked about the economics earlier, it needs to be more than just a voluntary carbon credit. right? So I think that's an exciting piece of evolution that I know, Land O'Lakes is obviously watching very closely as a cooperative system, but also just more generally, it'll be interesting to see how all that plays out. But yeah, to your point, absolutely has to be a policy component of this, or a public component. And there are a lot of different ways that the existing programs around agricultural sustainability and even crop insurance could potentially evolve to support these marketplaces.
Interesting. So, is this the whole carbon marketplace, and is this part of Truterra's Trucarbon platform? Is this part of the goal and trajectory of it?
Yeah. The Trucarbon platform is definitely one component of what we do, and that is exactly that, right? This was a carbon marketing platform to give our growers that we work with access to the voluntary carbon marketplace. And it's early days in the evolutionary journey for us. Essentially, this year was a pilot year for the Trucarbon platform, but kind of surprisingly, it's for us, we go big as part of this organization. So this is one of the bigger soil carbon programs in the United States for sure. But the entire goal here was basically to understand, what is the data lift for a farmer? What are the practices required? How does this actually play out for a farmer to engage with this marketplace, and how can we simplify and streamline and optimize that marketplace to get the maximum possible value back to the grower while removing as many different barriers to entry as we possibly can. They will continue to learn there, but for us, it has been a really good process and getting a lot of good engagement from our growers. But it has shown us firsthand that the conversation really does need to be about more than just carbon. It needs to be about what is the benefit to the farmer in general for evaluating these practices and for getting deeper insights through their data.
Yeah, it just boils kind of thing back to capitalism a bit. I love capitalism. I'm a huge fan of it, and what I find so interesting, what I'm drawn to, is how it can evolve. And it is a system, but I also think it's a philosophy, and we choose to participate in this system in varying degrees, either profits at all costs or profits and good at the same time. I think I don't think there's one way to do it. And that's what I think we're sort of seeing and what's emerging, and especially with this is, I think, a testament. The idea of the Trucarbon is a testament to how we can start building in some of these do goods, give back, not just take, while still earn our profits and live a sustainable lifestyle. And when I say sustainable, I don't mean just like environmentally. I mean just the fact that we can pay our bills and feed our kids, and financially. That's a big part of it. So
there's a piece of that I want to grab onto before we go on. Actually, I really like that capitalism point. I get excited about that because I think that's a reason for the activity that we're seeing right now, for the amount of energy and capital flow that we're seeing at a very high global level. Yeah. When it comes to climate change, is we're finally starting to connect the dots on what are the risk realities of climate change, right? So you can remove even the social good from it entirely. And there's a significant enough argument around these mitigation and adaptation movements that most companies have a very material financial risk posed by climate change. So you mentioned cryptocurrency earlier. One interesting correlation that I've heard is carbon marketplace today related to cybersecurity about 10 years ago, in the sense that only those companies that had the most material cyber risk, banks and folks like that, were really up on cybersecurity 10 or so years ago. Today, there isn't hardly a large firm that doesn't have a cybersecurity team and major cybersecurity focus, and it's because that risk became real and material very, very quickly. And I think we'll see the same thing in climate change, where companies are beginning to recognize just how real and material the risk is of some of the worst effects of climate change, and the best financial hedge against that risk is to invest in mitigation and invest in adaptation to climate change. So it can be for the social and societal good of climate change, but it's also, hey, you know what, if my company has an agricultural supply chain and the agricultural sector is at risk because of shifting weather and climate patterns, well, the best thing for me to do about that is invest in ways to adapt and to mitigate the worst effects. So in that way, I love it, because it can be triple bottom line, or it can be cold, hard, pure capitalism. And either way, there's an argument. right?
And are you finding, and I'm just curious, because I know everyone's receptive to different messages and any way you look at it and different ways you look at it. And I think that's a really interesting way to sort of parse it out and to have different lenses for it. So I think it does help, because I think maybe some listeners at home would be like, well, it's a no brainer. I mean, they're affecting the environment. Of course they have to do it. And well, we talked about it earlier. I mean, in the big picture, if it's not really financially, viable and it costs them more to do it, and, from what I understand, farming is not necessarily a super lucrative business. It's already hard enough. Why make it harder for yourself? I think this puts the optics on the big why, or how it can be sold to people in this position. So when you are speaking with the co-ops and farming leaders, is it mostly around the optics of finance and sustainability in the form of business, or is it more? Or are you weaving in some of the more environmental sides that sort of overlook the finance aspect of it?
Yeah, I would say it's certainly both. So I mean, agriculture, that's a passion lifestyle, right? I mean, you don't stay involved in the family farm with all the headaches and all the challenges that presents unless you're absolutely passionate about it. And part of that passion is stewardship of the land. And this is where the sustainability topic can sometimes be a little bit touchy on farm, because if you say you need to be more sustainable, that's to imply that you're not being sustainable. And for a farmer that's been on that same land for decades and generations, I mean, obviously they care about being sustainable, right? But it's kind of flipping the script and saying, okay, not just being sustainable, but what does this mean for the stewardship and long-term health of your land? And of course, there's new information to be had in terms of what soil health really means and what the benefits are and what long-term stewardship of that land means. So I think it's just a little bit having a more informed conversation, which only makes sense. The science has gotten better and the technology has gotten better. So we can have a more informed conversation around, seed population and nutrient management. We should have a more informed conversation around soil health and soil carbon and things like that. So it is both. But an important part to call out here too is just recognizing that, this isn't a conversation that the entire farm marketplace is ready for today.
Yeah.
Right. So I think a lot about the innovation adoption curve, right? This concept where we always have these leading innovators that they don't need to be convinced of anything. They'll have the new iPhone before it's out, right? But then you have that next tranche of folks who are paying attention to these innovators. So these innovators, I mean, we have people that have been in advanced soil health practices for decades already, but they have neighbors who've been watching them and waiting for a little bit more compelling reason to do the same thing on their own farm or to dabble in it. So it's that next 15%-ish of growers is really the audience for this conversation right now today. We've maybe got 5% of all growers in the United States sort of optimized for conservation agriculture and carbon capture. So it's not about appealing to all farmers and all ag cooperatives. It's about being able to support that next 15% or so who's just looking for the excuse to do this, and this little additional incentive might be just enough to get them off the fence.
Yeah, that story or that line of thinking, it reminds me of kind of the conversation I'm having with my parents just around the vaccine. I think I've gotten it. They have not. They're a little unsure, so they're just kind of watching me to see how it all shakes out. And I think, once they see I'm fine, they'll budge to do it. So I think that, I mean, it's a human psychology. I think it makes sense there. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think we've covered a lot of great things. And as we close, I would love to talk about purpose and then passion. That's part of the name of the show. We haven't actually really ever addressed it in a question on the show, but you brought it up when you were speaking about, farming lifestyle and it tends to be a passion, something that, is inherently deep, that pushes people or farmers to get up early and deal with all the headaches and the difficulty of it. You grew up that way. So I'm sure, that passion is still inside of you, obviously, as you've transitioned your farming career into a different sector of it. And then there's this idea of purpose, and you think about purpose, and it's kind of like this higher calling in a way, or this larger vision that you're working towards, or it's the North Star that helps guide the decision making for your passion in some ways. And I'm curious to, a lot of leaders, and CEOs and entrepreneurs always say, find your passion and do it. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of just it's not always financially reasonable or attainable to sort of follow your passion into a job or to make a living. And this is where I'm going with this. Is I'm just curious. I would love to hear your perspective on purpose over passion and how you have used one or the other to help sort of guide you through your career. It's a really long wind of saying that, and it's like I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but I think it really applies to what you're doing in a way. So I just would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one, and I think a lot about it. And honestly, that was the reason for kind of my career pivot into the sustainability space, was thinking about that passion and that driver. So, speaking to it with agriculture and kind of how that carries forward for me, when I talk about farmers needing to be passionate, you need to be passionate and almost a little bit crazy to be a farmer, in the sense that you are a price taker for everything that goes into your farm production. You are a price taker for what you sell, and you are completely at the mercy of the weather. So when you think about it as a business model, that's a pretty difficult business model where you have so little control. The only thing you can control is basically how hard you work at it to give yourself the best chance in that environment where you control so very little. And then you need to love what you do. You need to love driving around and seeing the crops and seeing the impact. So what that's translated into for me in the sustainability space is seeing, the battle against climate change. I think that's the inherent farmer part of me, is taking this problem that's a big, hairy problem that I don't have a fighting chance of solving before the time that I'm dead, but it's important, right? So that's what gets me fired up, is this big, difficult problem that agriculture can have such a huge impact in. So what I'm passionate about is being able to kind of try and translate that impact back to the farm, right? Because the two are obviously connected, but some CPG that is, a multinational that just sources a bunch of agricultural inputs or, agricultural products, they don't necessarily know how to translate the message of why they care about greenhouse gas emissions back to the farm in a way that's meaningful and actionable on farms. So being able to sort of serve as that translator to drive positive impact on farm, but then aggregate that positive impact at scale in a way that has a real chance to move the needle sort of on a truly planetary level. When we think about making an impact in ag, that's where it really taps into passion for me. But I think when it comes to, the fight against climate change and just sustainability in general, you don't have to burn down your whole career and go to work as a sustainability professional like I did to actually do something about it and care about it. So, I mean, it's the littlest things, but I think just get involved in the conversation and realizing that, one, we absolutely have to do something about it. Every single human being on the planet has a vested interest in figuring this out. But two, just kind of carrying the message goes a long, long way of actually just paying attention and caring about it and asking about it wherever you work. Hey, what does my company do in this space? What's our position on our greenhouse gas emissions footprint? Some companies will have a good answer and others won't. And maybe that's a place where you can say, hey, can we look into it? And who knows where it'll go.
Well, I think that there's the beauty of it. And also that response is going to evolve, and which is what I find super interesting is just as more information and more time doing it and the more time experiencing it, seeing it, we evolve and those reasons evolve. And I think that's kind of the really interesting and beautiful thing of it. But Nick, thank you so much. I feel smarter after this conversation. So thank you. I appreciate the time. I know you're super busy. So thank you. I hope to talk to you soon.
It was my pleasure. This was great.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we go, I want to put it out there that I need your help. Reviews are the best way that we can grow our audience. So please head on over to the Apple Podcast app and leave a review. I really hope this has been an informative and inspiring podcast as you think about your business, self, and how it all rolls into creating a more purposeful and sustainable lifestyle. See you next week.